Welcome to the Nitec podcast. Today I have with me Karacaer, Senior Reservoir Engineer at Nitec LLC, and author of the paper Integrated Numerical Modeling of Huff-n-Puff Pilot in Eagleford. Janeer, welcome.
Hi, Matt. I'm excited to be here and
Great.
talk to you about our work.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about it as well. I was really excited to hear your paper at URTEC recently, and I know a lot of people were interested in it, and there were a lot of questions that came up in the question session, and I'm hoping we can maybe go into some of those now to shed some light on a lot of these questions that I know a lot of people have.
Sure.
So maybe to start with, you could just elaborate a bit on what you feel is the novelty presented by this paper. What is new here, would you say?
I would say the novel part is we have a very high resolution lease model. So we have all the wells in it in the model. And the thing about this, the special thing about this unit is we have 3 infills and 2 refracs. They are just completed after they zipper fracked basically after the production of parent wells they produce about 10 years. So we have those wells, and we have a monitor well or science well, some call it, that we have downhole gauges along the lateral, about 9 of them. So that's very novel. And we have different analysis. We have fiber optic in that monitor well. As I said, the downhole gauges. We have actually a core sample from the lateral section of that monitor well. So we have a lot of data that we can validate our model. And of course, we have over 10 years of production data, pressure data, water, oil, and gas rates, bottom-hole pressure values during production and during hydraulic fracturing for some wells, but not for all wells. And we have a kind of understanding of how these wells fracked and what is the impact of different completions to the overall production performance of these wells. So and when you look at it, the parent wells, some of them have very standard legacy completions that was carried out in 2013, 2012. In those years, and there are some trials that with extreme limited entry, wider cluster spacing. So what we did actually take all the wells, refracs and infills, and calibrated all the wells within a single unified deformation tables, what we call deformation. So basically how the fractures open up or close during production. So I think that's a novelty. It's when you look at it, so we didn't take a just portion of the well. So we modeled full length of the wells. And I think that's very important too when you think about that. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that in a minute. So local heterogeneities are very important. When we think about the unconventionals, we usually think very homogeneous, like a slab of reservoir, maybe some heterogeneities vertically with different formations, but we don't think about much of this local heterogeneities or the lateral heterogeneities in the unconventionals. And what we see in the modeling, they are very, very important especially when you think about it, when you think about the gas Huff-n-Puff.
Yeah, let's drill down on that. Actually, that was one of the most interesting aspects to me, because as you say, it's very difficult. We usually don't have enough information to capture and represent and characterize these local heterogeneities or faults or weakness planes or anything like that. We often suspect that they're there, but we rarely have the information that we would need to explicitly model them. And that was one thing I thought was particularly interesting about this project. Is you have this highly detailed map of the local heterogeneities.
Yeah. So actually, this is not new for us. I mean, we were doing some frac hit analysis in maybe 7 eight years ago in Eagleford, again, the southwest of Eagleford, and we see the frackets of like some of the wells got fracked by the fracking of the an infill well 2 miles away, 3 miles away. So we suspected that there is something there that we at the time we didn't know what that is. We called it weakness planes or subseismic faults, or basically a local heterogeneity that carry fluids. If you inject something with high pressure, they go to 2 miles, 3 miles away. But at that time, we didn't have the proper characterization of those features. So we used statistical methods. We put like these weakness planes every 100 feet, every 300 feet, every 400 feet, and just look at the results from the frackets and calibrated our models and find the correct spacing of those weakness planes at that particular model, right? That particular reservoir. So, and what we see is actually when you look close to the faults or the fault corridors in Eagleford, you see the increasing number of these features from south to north most of the time. And we suspected that all these features are there all the time, and we can see the impact of those with frackets, but they play a great role or very important role when you inject gas, because the gas is very low viscosity. When you inject gas, they just carried out by these features, and they just can show up in a couple of miles away from the injector well.
Right. Yeah. And so in this particular case, you had this web of interlinking. Essentially, I guess do you think of them as faults? Do you think of them as easily activated fractures?
Yeah, that's nice. It's a complicated one. We actually don't know what they are in terms of when you look at the geological time or the geophysics. When you look at, you can see them with seismic, or you can actually create realizations that you can basically kind of know where they are with end tracking. But what we see is they are not like faults, so there is no trove in them. But when you inject something, they are very easy to deform. So you can just create tensile fractures within them very easily. So there's limited shear component. So they are like biving fractures, basically. So we don't create much of a surface area. We create these very long, high tensile fractures. And they are, when you compare to the normal hydraulic fractures, they are longer, less surface area. Basically, the deformation, I don't want to say easier, or they don't break at lower pressures. They are just like normal rock, but when you deform them, they create these large tensile fractures.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, because I feel like we're always encountering something like this, but we don't have the geological characterization to explicitly represent it. We do some kind of statistical method, as you were describing. To match frac hits between distant wells, you need some feature like this, right? And I just thought it was really great that you were able to capture it, and not only capture it, but really put the effort into specifically characterizing that feature, because that seems to be extremely critical for Huff-n-Puff in particular, where where the gas is going and staying and coming back from in detail is very, very important. I was wondering if you would talk about your new sort of conceptual model for understanding and thinking about Huff-n-Puff, which is related to this, where you have your three Cs of Huff-n-Puff, which obviously has a lot to do with this explicit network of high conductivity features, but also just overall, I think, is a necessary mental model for understanding Huff-n-Puff as we move into this phase of secondary recovery.
Yeah, when you think about what people usually do when they evaluate pilots or gas Huff-n-Puff, you see like a single well with a couple of stages and very homogeneous reservoir, and they look at different things like the impact of diffusion, the impact of injection pressure, or the scheme, how you inject or do huff and puff. But when you think about it, so the reservoir, the actual reservoir, or the configuration we have with the wells, it's very, very complicated. So we have multiple wells within a unit. We have these features, and we have wells, and the spacing between those wells are vary, and the completions are vary. So when you look at it, when you inject gas, the gas shows up in neighborhood wells really quickly. So the gas breakthrough time is usually very fast because we have fractures there with a very low viscosity fluid, which is hydrocarbon gas. When you inject it, they just carried out by these fractures. So there is that. So when we look at it over the years, we have been doing pilots in different basins, and what we come up with is that when you look at it, is the most important parameter that you need to have, or you need to characterize or know, or the impact of huff and puff, is actually the contact or the surface area that you have. So that's not something you can control when you do huff and puff pilot, but you can select different units with high contact. So in finance, there is an expression that the cash is king, and for huff and puff, I think that's the surface area is the king, or the contact is the king.
Yeah, that's good.
Because there are multiple factors that play in contact, just not the surface area. The matrix permeability that you have is also an important parameter. But the matrix permeability, when you do huff and puff, is not the same as the initial matrix permeability, because you produce sometimes millions of barrels of oil from those matrix rock. So the permeability that you see in after 10 years of depletion is much lower than the initial one. So there are multiple factors, but the surface area is very important. So when you do this modeling pilot or the huff and puff pilots, you have to have a very good understanding of the contact or the surface area you create. Given that you have sufficient containment of gas, even sometimes you can have enough contact or surface area, but if you cannot contain the gas, because that could be because of the features, the local heterogeneity we mentioned, or a lack of a caprac, let's say. It's not a correct term, maybe the caprac. When we say caprac and containment, we usually think about CO2 sequestration or CO2 storage. But same thing applies here. If you inject gas and even if you lose to another formation, or if the gas is out of the target formation, you basically lose that gas. Sometimes you produce that gas back, but it's just doing a huff and puff. Basically, you inject and produce that gas. So containment is given that we have enough containment, and also the connectivity as well. So you can inject from one well, and that gas can show up in the other well. So you might be just produce the injected gas from the neighbor wells. So sufficient, given that we have sufficient containment and some sort of a lower degree of connectivity, it's very important for huff and puff pilot. And then, given those, the contact is very, very important. And another aspect of the contact is when you inject gas, if you don't inject with sufficient or high rates, you can just inject to the toe or the heel of the well, and you just basically lose the surface area. So that's important to distribute the gas along the wellbore somewhat, homogeneously, or just avoid any bias in the wellbore when you do injection. So that's another point of contact.
Would you see that there's a right amount of communication? Like if you have too little communication between wells, then you're essentially not sweeping the area, and if you have too much, then the gas is just bypassing. Is that a right way of thinking about it, or am I missing something?
For unconventionals, when you do huff and puff, the main mechanism is not a sweeping mechanism. I mean, there is a play that when you inject gas, you probably push the oil in the fractures to the neighboring wells or the offset wells. If you have a collector well, you basically just push the oil to that collector well. But when you think about it, the fracture volume is so small that amount of oil that you recover from sweeping the fractures are pretty low. So the main mechanism is just you inject gas, the gas goes into the matrix, mixed with oil, swells the oil, hopefully above miscibility pressure, but it's not the end of the day if it's not above miscibility pressure. You again gain that swelling of oil and the relative permeability impacts and stuff like that, and just you get that oil back from huff and puff.
So would it be more accurate to say you're not getting oil from anywhere outside of the original SRVs? So you're just depleting more efficiently from the existing SRV of the primary depletion. Is that a more accurate than, because I realize sweep is the wrong word, but obviously you are getting more oil, but so that oil is not at all coming from the space between these wells. It just so happens that you have connectivity between them through the fracture network, but that doesn't imply that you're sort of targeting the oil between them.
Yeah, so the target is the remaining oil that we have in the matrix. And when we inject gas and start huff and puff, usually it starts with getting the remaining oil from the near wellbore region. But with time, as we see in multiple projects, that with time, when you build up pressure and if you are able to push the gas into matrix at the fracture tips, you can get oil from there as well. So yes, you can get the remaining oil in between the wells if you have the fractures. But if you don't have any fractures, let's say you have a very wide cluster spacing and there's a remaining oil between those clusters, it's very unlikely that you will get that remaining oil there because there is no surface area or the fractures that can transmit gas from wellbore to that area.
So there's no connectivity and there's no contact.
So when you look at the 3 Cs, this is like a roadmap. And when you think about huff and puff pilots, there is a trade-off most of the time. You cannot, if you don't have enough contact, let's say if in a given unit, if you have like 5 wells, actually the surface area is less, but the connectivity between the wells or among the wells are less. So you have very efficient use of gas, but at the same time, you don't have enough contact or surface area. So it's give or take. This is an optimization problem when you look at it. So the question that we ask and actually working on right now is, should we do huff and puff or gas injection before drilling the infills and doing refracs, or after, which is better? Because when you drill infills and refracs, you will create more surface area, so you will have more contact, but at the same time the connectivity among wells is high. So when the utilization of the gas could be lower. So there is a trade-off there that we should look at when selecting the pilot unit, or if you are selected that, how you can mitigate any problems that can arise from those high connectivity pathways.
And it seems like you would need to do some kind of detailed modeling effort to really determine definitively whether you're going to be creating too much, undesired connectivity if you do the refracts or the infills. There's kind of no way to know a priori whether that is going to be a good idea or not, unless you model it. I would think.
Yeah, that's that. I mean, when you look at it, the connectivity is not uniform among the wells. So you cannot just I'm going to take these two wells and look at it that way. That's the well spacing portion of it. And also the landings of the wells could be different. And on top of it, we have these weakness planes or local heterogeneity that carry fluid. And when you look at it, the pictures in the picture in the paper, it's some of the wells cross these weakness planes 3 times, 4 times, some of it just 1 time. So there is a non-uniform gas distribution when you inject gas in the reservoir. So it's very high complex, and just we looked at the impact of weakness planes, how that plays out for Huff-n-Puff, and actually the oil recovery we get after I believe after 3 years was 20% lower if you add those weakness planes. If you don't put those weakness planes, you probably overestimate your recovery from Huff-n-Puff.
So does that imply that you would prefer to do puff and puff in areas that don't have weakness planes?
Yes. Okay. If you have, then you should probably look at conformance control kind of things. Or, I mean, this is not the end of the day. I mean, you can have some sort of connectivity between the wells. The important thing, when you inject one group of wells, if that gas goes into the production wells within the unit or in the neighboring lease units, that could create a lot of problems with royalties and stuff like that. That's another problem. And the other thing, the gas is not working for you. But it's not 100%. Some of it goes into the matrix, some of it goes to the neighboring well. Some maybe you can lose to the upper formations, probably because of these weakness planes. And some of it you will produce it back, some of it will stay there. So it's a very hard problem when you think about it in a lease unit perspective.
Like you said, it's an optimization problem.
Yeah.
You have to consider everything. I think related to this idea of, how did we actually achieve this? I know there were a lot of questions in the URTEC session related to, from a actual simulation modeling perspective, how did you simulate, the injection of water into this system, injection of frac fluid into this system, the breaking of the rock, especially as it pertains to these high conductivity features, and then the flow back and all of this. And I just wondered if you would talk a little bit about the specifics of the numerical modeling there.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I get a lot of questions about the water production, how we match the water production. And the simple answer for that, if you include the proper physics if you have the proper physics in the simulator, it's kind of, you cannot avoid to match water. So it's very important because the water match is the number one predictor of the surface area within the reservoir you created with hydraulic fractures. So if you inject in the simulator, if you inject water, create these hydraulic fractures with as a function of stress, and you create the surface area. If you have proper physics, it basically tells you how much of the water goes into the matrix because of the imbibition, and how much of it is trapped in at the fracture tips, or how much of it just fall down within those fractures. And it's very, very important for us to determine the correct amount of surface area that we create, or the complexity of the hydraulic fractures that we have as a function of stress and as a function of completion treatment. So not all completion treatments are the same. So some of it have lower injection rates, lower injection volumes with gel. Some of it has slick water with high volumes, high fluid loading, high propellant loading. So if you have the correct physics there, you can basically account for all the mechanisms in the reservoir, including the proppant as well. So the proppant plays a role as well. When you open up the when you put these wells on production, you produce some of the fractures are closed. The prop regions doesn't close as much. At the fracture tips close higher. You see the pinch out of water in at the fracture tips and at the bottom of the hydraulic fractures. So it's very, very important for us to get the water rate match correct. And what we see in Eagleford specifically, the water rates that we get initially for the parent wells are very, very low. Most of it imbibes into the matrix because the Eagleford, it's a very well cooked rock, so it's very thirsty. So when you inject water, it goes into the matrix really easily. And the water cost you get usually around 10 to 15%. But that's different for refractors. When you look at the refractors, and we show it in the paper as well, that the refractors produce a lot of water. And there are a couple of reasons for that you have to have that the model the interaction of the existing primary fractures and the newly created fractures with hydraulic fracturing. So that's the key to get the water rate match correct for refractures. Water rate is the and the frackets as well. When you have frackets, that's another thing for to get things right, at least reduce the uncertainty as much as possible. We know that when you do a calibration, there are multiple solutions, as you know, and you cannot avoid that. But because we have too many knobs to play with, but if you have these refracts, infills, and 10 parent wells, a science well, you can reduce that uncertainty with a great degree. So we are very confident that we have a very representative, physically representative model in this particular case.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were surprised just by the overall approach of using a dual porosity simulation approach and then superimposing on top of this a more explicit representation of where these weakness planes were, because I think maybe some people think of those as being incompatible. It's like you think of weakness planes maybe as being something that needs to be represented as an explicit planar fracture, something that you import from somewhere else, and in fact it's all baked into the same end-to-end dual porosity with stress solution model. And so when you're injecting the fluids and you're calibrating the model, you're determining is that frac fluid going into the dual porosity fracture network? Is it going into these high conductivity features? And then you're tuning like you said, the dilation tables to ensure that the balance is actually correct. And like you just said, if it is correct, then you'll correctly model both, the production obviously, but also the communication between the wells in the form of frac hits.
And one of the things that we are lucky to have is the downhole pressure gauge, downhole gauge data, and the CPG tests. And when you look at it, because the existence of weakness planes and how they play out was a topic of debate among the team. Some believe that, yes, we have these features, but they don't do much in terms of, or they are not very different than, let's say, the normal rock. But when we have those gauge data, you can clearly see that the gauges that coincides with weakness planes see large drawdowns or high pressure frac heads from the neighboring wells when we frac infills and refracts. So we validated our assumption or the geological model, the geomodel that we have with that gauge pressure. And the CPG, the jaw pressure group tests are very important to determine the connectivity among the wells in the short term. So CPG tests in nature, they just last a couple of days or a couple of weeks. So we know that we have the correct communication at least in the areas that we have gauges. So that was a very interesting point as well.
Yeah, I thought that was particularly interesting because without those gauges, you could have your model essentially correct and not really be that certain of it because you're not you maybe know that you're statistically correct but not exactly right. But having those gauges, it's really sort of a binary yes no. We have the connectivity dialed in. So that was really I think convincing to a lot of people that was present. Well, I think that hits all of the main bullet points that I wanted to hit upon. Did you have any other particular items you wanted to talk about?
So I think we are coming in a era of, so we basically have maturing basins or maturing fields in the United States. If you look at the Eagleford, Bakken, and other basins, that we have basically three tools that we have in our pocket that we can put infills, and I think I'm guessing that's gonna at least we're gonna for 10 years we're gonna put infills there, especially in Permian, not in Eagleford. So that's the first tool that we have. The second tool is the refracturing. The refracturing could be very good in certain places, and especially in Eagleford and Permian. We'll see what's going to happen there. But when you think about it, the oil we left behind, because we are leaving behind almost maybe 80% of the oil behind, with the most efficient completions and after refraction. So that's the only way that we can get that oil is EOR, particularly gas Huff-n-Puff. I mean, there are some other things that we can enhance gas Huff-n-Puff, like surfactant injection or mobility control things, kind of thing. But eventually, if the gas price stays low, around $2 to $3, and oil price is above 70, when you look at that ratio, if it's above 130, 1 divided by 30, I think the gas Huff-n-Puff could be a good candidate to get the remaining oil. But if you are going to do a pilot, I bet the most important thing to get the connectivity and containment issues beforehand, before doing any pilot, as much as possible, as because probably we don't have much of a data most of the time, especially in Permian. I mean, this unit particularly that we have sponsored by DOE, so we have a monitor well and downhole gauges and stuff like that. So it's a lot of money. So I'm guessing we won't have that much of a data in the future, but these uncertainties should be considered before doing any pilots or selecting a unit for doing a pilot. And I hope that the 3Cs framework could be a roadmap for operators to get a mental model. How should we approach the pilot unit selection, or if we select it, how we can mitigate any problems that can arise from like containment issues or the connectivity issues.
Well, thanks, Jenner. This was really interesting work. I'm sure people are going to get a lot of value out of it, and particularly, like you said, this 3Cs framework. And thank you for joining us on the Nitec podcast. If you're interested in learning more about this work, you can download Jenner's paper, Integrated Numerical Modeling of a Huff-n-Puff Pilot in Eagleford, or you can contact us directly at solutions@nitecllc.com.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt.